meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2021, and can I please remind everyone to turn mobile phones and other devices to silent during the meeting. We have a full agenda today, including a number of private items, so if I ask in advance that members and witnesses keep comments as concise as possible, that would be very much appreciated. Our first item on the agenda today is to decide whether to take agenda items 9, 10 and 11 in private, and I'm looking if any members do not agree to that, if they could put an R in the chat function. Thank you. And it's agreed to take those items in private. Thank you very much. Agenda item 2 is to consider the following negative instrument: the Children's Hearing Provision of Information by Principal Reporter, Specified Persons, Scotland Regulations 2020, SSI 2020-449. The details of the instrument are in the paper. Do members have any comments on this instrument? I'm not seeing any indication, so I'll move on to agenda item 3. Agenda item 3 is consideration of provision of early learning and childcare Specified Children Scotland Amendment Order 2020 draft. This is a draft subordinate legislation subject to the affirmative procedure. An affirmative instrument has 2 agenda items. First, the committee will have an opportunity to ask of the Minister, and after that, ask questions of the Minister, and after that, we will turn to agenda item 4 when there will be a debate on the motion. We are operating remotely, and I would ask members at agenda item 4 to record their vote on the motion in the text box in blue jeans using a yes or no. I will provide more details of this system when we reach agenda item 4. Can I welcome to the meeting this morning Marie Todd, MSP, Minister for Children and Young People, Ellen Lever, Head of Parents, Providers and Workforce Unit, Scottish Government, and Carolyn O'Malley, Principal Legal Officer of the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. And I would like to invite Marie Todd to make an opening statement to explain the order.
Thank you, Convener. I know this is a matter of interest to this committee and across the Parliament, so I'm pleased we've laid an affirmative statutory instrument to introduce automatic funded early learning and childcare for all children who defer Primary 1 start from August 23. This legislation will allow parents to make decisions on deferral based on the needs of their child without facing the uncertainty of financial barriers to ELC. This change means that many more children will become eligible for funded ELC, and we need to know that we have the space available for them. That's why we announced £3 million in December to support 5 local authorities to pilot implementation during 2021 to 22. We expect to include additional authorities in 22-23 to further widen our evidence base. We're working with as many authorities as possible within the funding available and have established a deferral working group to gather and share useful information. In the interim, I expect decisions by local authorities on deferral funding requests to continue to be made on the on the basis of the well-being of the individual child. Having made the difficult decision in March to pause the 1140 expansion due to coronavirus, I am very pleased to say we've now legislated to reintroduce the statutory duty to deliver the obligation by August 2021. While this is welcome progress, we must be mindful that delivery in parallel with our deferral commitment requires a balanced approach. Given the challenges we continue to face, it is more important than ever to ensure that the required capacity and capability is in place to avoid a further delay to the 1140 hours expansion. I'd also like to recognise the significant achievements of the Give Them Time campaign. The data they've collected showing the local authorities are approving more requests for funded deferrals is a testament to how incredibly hard the councils are working to deliver funded ELC to Scotland's children. I'm happy to respond to any specific questions the committee has.
Thank you very much, Minister. I have indications of a couple of questions. I'll go first to Mr. Gray.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Minister. The Minister knows that I've been a great supporter of the Give Them Time campaign, so she will not be surprised to know that I'm very pleased this legal change is going to happen, as the campaign is, but she'll also not be surprised to know how disappointed I am that it isn't going to happen until 2023. The fact of the matter is that we're correcting a legal anomaly here, so parents have the right to decide, without reference to anybody else, if they think it's best for their son or daughter, decide to defer. But until this comes into force, they don't have the right that every other preschool child has to fully funded hours for, and in this case, 5-year-olds. So this was a legal anomaly, and surely the thing about a legal anomaly is it is an anomaly, it needs to be reversed, and it needs to be reversed quickly and immediately. That's what Parliament asked the Minister to do, I think almost 2 years ago. What's more, this particular effect, of course, only applies once to any particular child. Either they have this right or they don't, and if they don't have it, they can't have it retrospectively because, of course, by then they're 6, 7, 8 years old. So the delay in this means that many children, many families have not benefited from it, and the delay till 2023 means that many, perhaps hundreds of families will continue not to be able to avail themselves of this right. So I have 2 questions really for the Minister. The first is, why on earth has it taken so long to do this, and why on earth does it take so long to come into effect? And the second is, when it comes to the pilot which she's just described, the Give Them Time campaign have pointed out, and she thanked them for the data, that the 5 local authorities she's chosen for the pilot already agree 100% of applications. So this pilot is nothing really but a joke, is it? Why don't we have a pilot which forces some of the councils who don't agree funding to agree it from now on?
Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Gray, for your questions, and I absolutely agree that you have shown a great deal of interest in this campaign, and you will remember that the Parliament asked us to legislate in this term of Parliament, and that is precisely what we're doing. We set a realistic timetable for the implementation of extended eligibility for all deferrals to ensure that the rollout of 1140 hours of funded ELC to all eligible children isn't put at risk. It's just not possible for us to expect all local authorities to implement the new commitment at the same time as rolling out the 1140 hours against the continued backdrop of the challenges imposed by the COVID-19 response. Therefore, we've set a realistic timetable to full implementation of extended eligibility for all deferrals. It's important to note that this policy has the potential to have a significant impact on the number of new children attending ELC. The total of number of children that will become newly eligible for funded ELC in 2023 is around 20,000 children. And our pilot approach will help us to better understand the likely impact on numbers and to ensure that we have the space available in our ELC settings. And we'll be working with all local authorities to consider what it means for their capacity.
Okay, I have a number of members wishing to come back in. Could you please try and be succinct, as we do have a very full agenda, but I'll bring in Mr. Gray for a quick supplementary, please.
I would just say to the Minister, does she understand that Parliament asked her to introduce this change in this Parliament? She may be legislating for it in this Parliament, but it's not going to be introduced till the middle of the next Parliament. Frankly, that's just sophistry.
Minister?
I'm not sure there was a question in there, but certainly we have done as Parliament asked. We are legislating in this term of Parliament, and I've explained the reason for the delay clearly. I cannot introduce this legislation now and put at risk 1140-hour expansion. I cannot do that.
Can I bring in Ms Mackay to be followed by Ms Wishart, please? Thank you.
Yes, my colleague Fulton McGregor has been very involved with the Give Them Time campaign, and he apologises for not being able to be here today. He's at another committee meeting, but he asked if I could ask some questions. It's very similar to along the lines that Ian Gray has asked, which is would more pilots be considered for this year, and possibly the ones that are not already doing it, and would the government work with or ask COSLA to permit self-funding in any ELC setting if local authority funding is refused for deferral?
Minister?
We're considering more pilots in the second year. So this year we are only introducing the pilots as announced, but we're considering expanding the piloting next year. The challenge we have is not understanding what parental behaviour how this change is going to influence parental behaviour. We know that there's 20,000 children who will become newly eligible, but we don't think that all of those in that age bracket will choose to defer. So estimating the deferral rates is really challenging, and we can't. We only have data for January and February at the moment. We can't determine the relative importance of the offer of funded provision versus parental choice. And a further complication is that the extension of ELC, the ELC expansion to 1140 hours, which looks like a primary school week, will possibly influence parental choice for those children born in January and February. As deferral becomes more of a norm, even though there's no change in provision for those children. So we are keen to understand well what the behavioural changes involved with this change are going to be before we continue to full roll out. In terms of the funding, I spoke to Give Them Time just in December the 3rd. On December 3rd, I met with them. That was one of their asks. I will certainly seek to ensure that where possible, children are able to defer when their parents choose. But I refer back to the processes that the child's parents should be involved in the decision making, and the decision should be made in the best interest of the child. So the process at the moment should ensure that those parents who are seeking deferral for their children are able to access it as things stand at the moment.
Thank you, Minister. Can I bring in Ms Wishart to be followed by Mr Green?
Thank you, Convener. I've supported the move to a legal right to funded deferrals throughout the Give Them Time campaign, but I've grave concerns about what the government has brought forward today. The Minister will know that those working in the campaign were disappointed with the announcement that the full right to deferral won't exist across Scotland until 2023. And as has already been pointed out, the pilot councils were already accepting 100% of their applications. And this year, of all years, children have missed out on so much because of the virus. Some will barely remember socialising with anyone outside their bubble. And we know how critical early years are to life chances and attainment. But this August, there will be a £4,500 price tag hanging over families who want to give their children more time. And children only start school once. Children starting this year might not remember what it's like to play with other children. Playgroups and social events haven't been an option, and nurseries have been stop-start. So the plan for 2023 fails to recognise how difficult the next group of school starts might find the adjustment. We've taken evidence on this before, but I'm yet to hear a convincing justification for why 2023 is the best we can do. Why should deferrals not be available to every family who thinks it's right for them?
Minister?
I'm acutely aware that this year has been a really difficult one for children. It's important to note that schools and ELC settings are working really hard to support their children at this time. They know that Primary 1 children this year missed part of their ELC last year and have had a completely different transition. And come August, they will be ready to support the next cohort. And I've already said many times, in Scotland, we don't think of children as being school ready, but of schools as being child ready. Where it is clearly in the child's best interest to remain in ELC for an additional year, whether that's due to the impact of COVID-19 or otherwise, the current system of child-centred decision-making should enable that. And it's really important that the decisions are the needs of an individual child rather than a blanket policy. Most children will be eager to start school in August as normal, and I know that schools in ELC settings are carefully considering the needs of this cohort. They plan that transition.
Mr. Green, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I'm listening with interest to the exchange thus far. I'm still unclear, and maybe the Minister can clarify why there is a need for a delay. I haven't heard full justification for that, and the reasons for that is because I think, as the Minister acknowledges herself in the context of everything that's happened in the past year, there may be parents who are not convinced by the quote that the current system should enable deferral. There's no guarantees in there, and the problem for many parents is that if that funding is refused, it will come at a huge price tag to them if they choose to defer. I don't understand the interlink between the delay and the rollout of 1140, for example, and nor do I understand the justification on whether this is a capacity issue or a funding issue, because my understanding is there is capacity in the system. The problem is only on funding, and therefore that's one that could be addressed immediately in the forthcoming budget.
Minister?
So thank you, Mr. Green. I have to disagree that the main challenge about introducing this policy is actually capacity. So we confirmed the new date for the rollout of 1140 expansion in August, for August this year. Really careful consideration was given to a date, to deciding the date that can be reasonably met and doesn't require approaches to be taken that would provide less flexibility for families, poorer experience for children until longer term solutions were delivered. So we know that a change to ELC availability, such as extending the obligation to fully fund deferrals, could impact on capacity locally. We've therefore set a realistic timetable for full rollout. And to ensure that the policy is implemented smoothly, we've established a pilot scheme in the interim to monitor the impact of the policy and to better understand the likely uptake of the entitlement and to inform the wider rollout of the legislation. In terms of the financial impacts, they're not insignificant. The challenge is that we are unable to estimate them at the moment. So when we incorporate this additional duty, we will build that into the multi-year funding agreement that we come to with local authorities, but there's real uncertainty over the uptake and therefore the annual additional revenue required, and it could range from 33 million per year to 82.5 million per year. The pilot approach will give us the opportunity to monitor the likely uptake of the entitlement and to improve our understanding of the consequent impact on available capacity and the financial implications.
Thank you very much, Minister. That exhausts questions at agenda item 3. We'll now move to agenda item 4, which is the formal debate on motion S5M 23665. If members wish to take part in the formal debate, could they indicate by putting an R in the chat? But can I now ask the Minister to move the motion? Thank you. I have a number of, I have members wishing to come in, so could I bring in, please, Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Parents must immediately be given the legal right to defer, to both defer primary one and have it replaced with funded early learning and childcare. The only question that should be in parents' minds is whether putting off entry into P1 is the best thing for the child. I believe the government has the ability to remove this extra financial power barrier and empower parents to do what they feel is right, and consequently, I can't support this.
I see no other indications that members wish to take part in the debate. Minister, do you wish to respond to Ms Wishart?
What I would say is that the approach we are already taking in the existing legislation puts the best interests of the child absolutely right at the centre of the decision. It must be the top priority in the decision that's made. And that's been set out in our statutory guidance for local authorities. So that's the first and foremost thing that should be in the mind of local authorities too. A reminder of that statutory duty was sent to directors of education when we informed them of this legislation. I'm disappointed if Beatrice Fisher cannot support this significant improvement and future commitment today.
Thank you, Minister. As we're meeting remotely and it's not easy to see members on screen, we will therefore vote on the SSI using the text box on blue jeans to indicate if we're agreed. Once I ask the question in the motion, I'll ask members to put a Y for yes, or an N for no, A for abstain in the text box, and then I will read out those votes. So the question is that motion S5M 23665 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We have votes. Mr. Gray has voted yes. Mr. Gibson has... Sorry. My apologies. Mr. Gray has voted yes. Mr. Gibson, yes. Mr. Johnson, yes. Mr. Mandel, no. Mr. Adam, yes. Mr. Neil, yes. Ms. Mackay, yes. Mr. Greer, yes. Ms. Bishop, no. Jamie Green, no. And as convener, I have voted yes. And I believe that that motion is therefore agreed to. We'll now move to agenda item 5, which is subordinate legislation. Again, it's consideration of the Children's Hearings Scotland Act 2011, Rules of Procedure in Children's Hearings, Amendment Rules 2021 Draft, SM5 23764. This is draft subordinate legislation and is subject to an affirmative procedure. Members know already that affirmative instrument has 2 agenda items, and can I repeat that the committee will have an opportunity to question the Minister, and after that we will turn to agenda item 6, which is the formal debate on the motion. Again, I would ask members to indicate if they wish to come in by putting an R in the chat function. So can I welcome to the meeting again the Ministers to speak to the motion, Marie Todd MSP, also Tom McNamara, Head of Youth Justice and Children Hearings Scotland, Scottish Government, and Margaret Mean, lawyer for the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. And again, Minister, can I invite an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener, for the opportunity to introduce the draft instrument. The central objective of these draft regulations is to ensure a proper opportunity to participate for the brothers and sisters and all those with similar relationships of the children coming before hearings. This especially applies where decisions could be made that will affect their contacts and relationships with the child subject to the hearing. The draft makes detailed provision for siblings around prior notification, invitation to attend, and rights to make representations, be accompanied or represented by another person, and to be informed about the outcome of the hearing as it relates to their interests. This will allow a broader, more inclusive approach to be taken to siblings' involvement around children's hearings. This follows the decision of the UK Supreme Court in the cases of A, B, C and XY last year. These cases, as the committee is aware, considered siblings' participative rights in children's hearings. The Supreme Court decision recognised that the legislative scheme behind the children's hearings was compatible with children's Article 8 rights. But we all want Scotland's childcare system to move from compliance towards excellence. The government therefore brought forward amendments to the Children's Scotland Act 2020 to enable these changes to happen. This reform would also enable Scotland to honour important aspects of the independent care review promise on siblings. The draft instrument also refines other aspects of children's hearings procedure in important additional areas. It mainstreams the electronic authentication of signatures and introduces more flexibility around electronic participation. Both of these were important features in last April's Emergency Coronavirus Act 2020. There's a shared appetite to hold those innovations for the benefit of families, decision makers and professionals. The draft instrument also empowers decision makers to exclude persons from a hearing where their conduct is dangerous, intimidating or disruptive. Exclusion may be necessary to obtain the views of a relevant person, such as in a domestic abuse situation. Finally, it enables earlier sharing of independent reports and assessment among professionals. This is aimed at promoting better preparations and more informed and productive discussions at children's hearings. I'd be happy to take questions from committee members.
Thank you, Minister. I see no member has indicated. If you wish to ask a question of the Minister, please put an R in the chat. I don't believe there are any questions for the Minister. Therefore, I will move directly to agenda item 6, which is a formal debate on motion S5M 23764. Can I invite the Minister to move the motion?
Moved.
Thank you. Minister, do you wish to say anything else to the motion?
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will therefore move to the vote, and again I would ask that members indicate whether they are content or not by using a Y, N or A in the text box. I will now put to the committee. The question is that motion S5M 23764 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And that's agreed unanimously by the committee, and I would like to thank the Minister for her attendance this morning and to the officials to cover those SSIs, and I'll pause very briefly to move to our next agenda item. Agenda item 7 is Redress for Survivors, Historical Child Abuse and Care Scotland Bill evidence session. Our next item is sorry, can I welcome to committee? I'm sorry, I'm just checking a note from the clerks. I believe that we have David Whelan, who's former Boys and Girls Abused in Quarriers Homes, in attendance. We are still waiting for confirmation from Mr. Aitken, but we will bring him on board if he manages to onboard for the meeting. We also have Helen Holland and Simon Collins, INCUS, and Janine Rennie, Chief Executive of Wellbeing Scotland. I will now move to questions from the committee, and I would ask members to indicate that they wish to ask a question by putting an R in the chat function. I move to Mr. Gray, first of all. Thank you.
Convener, the witnesses will know, because of course they were there and have been part of the evidence the committee took at stage 1, that the evidence they gave led in particular to a recommendation in the committee's report that the idea of the waiver, whereby those survivors who benefit from the redress scheme would waive their right to seek justice in the civil courts, that waiver should be removed from the bill. Now, they will have seen from the correspondence with the Deputy First Minister that he has gone some way to try and mitigate some of the effects of the waiver. Listened, for example, to the evidence that a longer time would be needed for survivors to decide whether they accept the redress payment and sign the waiver, or whether they refuse the redress payment to keep their right to civil justice. I suppose my question to the panel is a very simple one. In their view and the view of the survivors they represent, is that enough of a change, or do they believe still that the principle of the waiver is one which survivors feel undermines their confidence in the legislation?
would ask if the panel wish to come in, if they could indicate by putting an R in the chat function. I can't see everybody on screen, so raising a hand, I'm afraid, won't help me much with that. So I have initially Ms Rennie to be followed by Mr Collins. Thank you.
Yes, hello, thank you, Convener. We had a meeting yesterday with a large team of survivors, and we also have a team of survivors who have brought forward a petition about the waiver, and survivors are not satisfied at all by the changes that have been proposed. They still feel that the waiver is a betrayal of everything that they've been through over the years, and a large number of the survivors have said that they would kind of fight this all the way if they felt that a waiver was going to still be in place within the redress bill. They still come back to the same argument where they said that a lot of survivors would accept signing up to the redress bill, where years later circumstances may change. So, for example, a case that wasn't able to succeed, more survivors may come forward, and then a case would be able to succeed. So survivors feel that they wouldn't know all the possible ramifications when they would sign the waiver, even if it was maybe 2 or 3 years down the line. Things are changing all the time with more survivors coming forward and more ability really to kind of maybe seek civil redress. So survivors want the choice to be able to do so, and they really feel, a number have said to me it was a betrayal. The meeting yesterday was very angry again, and every meeting that we've had has been the same, and nothing that's been produced since then has changed that. They feel that it is an absolute betrayal, that their choice should be absolutely respected. And while I understand that there's been brought forward that the waiver's been there in a lot of other countries, survivors feel that the Scotland situation is unique and shouldn't be considered along with evidence from other areas.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Miss Holland to be followed by Mr Collins. Miss Holland, please.
Good morning. I think in relation to INCUS and the many survivors who engaged with the consultation, I would agree across the board that there was an element of misunderstanding, I think is probably the right word, because the biggest issue with the waiver is the fact that it's linked to contributions. Now the reality is it's all well and good to say that Scotland's unique. It's not unique in the sense that what we're talking about here is redress, and there's been redress in many countries. And the reality is that for, like even if I went down the civil court route, for talking sake, at the end of that process, I would need to sign probably a full and final settlement agreement or some kind of financial agreement. And the same if I was doing an out of court settlement, I'd probably have to do the same thing. The survivors have the right to go down the civil court route, and I think within the bill, the fact that we're now talking about a prolonged period of time, 6 months, for the survivor to get the independent legal advice. Within that legal advice, the survivors would be able to make a choice, and that's what's coming across from our members, is that everybody's talking about rights, but they haven't heard people talking about choice. And survivors have waited a long time for this coming, and many, quite frankly, have already made that choice for themselves. We have members that are going down the civil court route. Equally, we have members who are patiently waiting for the redress scheme to open and start. It will never ever suit everybody. That I don't dispute that at all. I think for me the biggest difficulty is there appears to be a lot of confusion. I don't think people fully understand that at the end of any financial settlement there would be an agreement. The reality is, if it's happened in every other country in the world, my concern is if it doesn't happen here, the care providers will simply stand back and do nothing, because they won't engage unless there's a waiver. If there isn't a waiver, who pays the redress? The reality is it's the taxpayers of Scotland. And how is that justice for the survivors? Because it means at the end of the process, they walk away without acknowledged it, acknowledging the fact that the people that allowed the abuse, or the organisations where the abuse took place, haven't been held to account, and I don't know any survivor that would find that justice. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying there's an easy answer. That's not for us to decide. Sadly, that's for the committee to decide. It is extremely difficult, but that is the predicament.
Thank you very much. And bring Mr. Collins in, please.
Thank you. The reason I thought it was helpful for Helen to speak before me is Helen can explain the view of the members of INCAS, and I'm aware there are different views on the issue of waiver, and there are legal opinions on the view of waiver. But having heard what the INCAS view is in connection with the waiver in general, I think the question that was asked was, are we satisfied with the steps that are proposed going from stage 1 to stage 2? And there are a couple things there. Firstly, the increased length of time to consult is essential, and that's recognised, that's welcomed. Secondly, if there is to be the waiver, and that's a big issue still, and an issue which others will engage in, if there's to be a waiver, then the consideration of that waiver being capable of revocation is also essential, because survivors don't believe that in every situation where an organisation undertakes to contribute that they will follow through, and their doubting of that position is based upon what has happened in the past. It's not some wild supposition. There are examples there. So they want to know that if they sign a waiver, which will mean that they are waiving rights, that those conditions have to be met, and if they're not met, they have the right to put that waiver aside and pursue the other action. So that's welcome. The point that I think that remains is the issue of proper advice. And you'll see in our written submission, I'm still concerned about the interpretation of section 89.2d and section 89.3 of the bill. 89.2d says that you will be given cover for legal advice on whether to accept an offer of redress payment and sign a waiver. And then we go on to section 89.3, which suggests that it will not include legal advice and assistance on whether to pursue litigation as an alternative to making an application for a redress payment. Now, that is to be read that people will not be able to seek legal advice before they engage in the process and before they make an application. I understand it. But if that is intended to be the point where the waiver is to be signed, it is totally unacceptable. You cannot waive a right without full understanding of what that right is. So there must be, and it must be made clear, because that, in my reading of it, is not clear. It must be made clear that at the time when survivors, if they are to sign a waiver, have to sign that waiver, they will be given proper advice. And I suggest that means Council's opinion on the prospects and the likely outcome of civil litigation. That's the only way you can make an informed decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Phelan has been able to join us. I'll bring him in shortly, but I'm just going to go very quickly back to Janine Rennie again.
Right. It was just a clarification of point. I mean, Helen did alluded to that survivors didn't really understand. I think one thing that's been really clear to me throughout this is that survivors have had a really clear understanding of what that means. And I think when survivors receive legal advice at the beginning of this process, they can't know the future. So they can't know what the prospects are of a civil action maybe 3 years hence. So that was the concerns a lot of them brought forward to me. Also, the point I forgot to mention is that the insurers have not been clear at all that they would contribute into a redress scheme. And for them, I think a lot of them, while some survivors may sign a waiver, say for Quarriers Homes, for example, you may have a large cohort. We've worked with about 135 survivors from Quarriers Homes, so a large cohort possibly wouldn't. So it doesn't mean there won't be civil litigation against that organisation because they contribute to the waiver scheme, because it could well be that one survivor waives their rights, but then another 100 survivors don't. So I don't see that there's really going to be any incentive for the insurance companies to contribute to the waiver scheme. The survivors don't see that connection. They don't see that there's a connection between the contribution of organisations and you know, whether or not they accept the waiver scheme. They're not really interested in whether organisations have signed up to that. They're more interested in the fact that they receive the maximum amount of compensation and justice for what they've endured.
Mr. Phelan, would you like to come in? appreciate you weren't here for the question, but
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Thank you.
we can.
Sorry about that. I think there was, apologies, there was an issue logging on. Thank you. I picked up some of the last part of the conversation. I understand it's around waiver. The issue for us is, and contributions, and the issue is the two of them being linked. And there was never suggestion in any of the consultation, and I agree with Janine's paper, there was no linkage of how that would come around. And in terms of a waiver, what I find extraordinary is that may want to contribute, such as quarriers, and so those residents will have to sign a waiver if this waiver comes into place. And if other institutions don't contribute, then those residents won't have to sign a waiver. So now you're creating a system, whoever thought this up, that completely discriminates against various residents, even at a base level. Now, we've been told that the waiver is based on contributions that they will come from the insurers. Now, I tell you, FPGA have worked out what the liability is for the current cases in quarriers. And that liability is significantly lower than what the Scottish Government are asking the organisation to contribute. Now, insurance companies are commercial companies, private companies, and so have a financial interest when they go to do business. Why does anybody think that an insurance company would contribute to a scheme far more money than they're being asked to do than what is actually their liability, their current liability? I just don't understand the rationale behind whoever came up with this plan. Thank you. If I missed part of your question, convener, I'm happy to, if you want to give me the question.
I think we'll keep the debate going, Mr. Whelan, and obviously if you want to come back in, we'll bring you back in. I'm going to bring Ms Holland in briefly just before we go back to Mr Gray.
Thank you. No, it is very briefly, and it's just in response to what Janine had said there. What I meant by survivors being confused was in the process of the consultation paper, it wasn't clear that the waiver, the link between the waiver and the contributions, that was the point I was making.
Thank you. I'll go back to Mr Gray.
Happy for colleagues to come in.
Okay, can I move to Ms Mackay, please?
Yes, just moving on a wee bit. I wonder if I could ask the witnesses their views on the variations between payment levels and the maximum level of payments, and also whether they think that higher payment levels might make survivors more amenable to the waiver. You know, if there was less of a difference between the different levels of redress scheme payments and civil court awards, would this make a difference to your views on the waiver?
Ms Holland, yes, please come in. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it absolutely would, because the reality is, I mean, if you're doing a comparison between the redress and the civil court action, the reality is a lot of survivors, especially the elderly now, we have many of our members are over the age of 65. So for them personally, and especially for the pre-64s, who, let's remember, have no choice on this alternative. If the settlement figures were more in line with civil court action, then I think absolutely and again it would need to be with the correct legal advice. But I think that would deem it to be more fair for the survivors who would engage with the redress scheme. I mean, obviously, if a survivor comes to the redress scheme and within that period they're receiving legal advice, and if the lawyers are saying to them, well, actually, with the evidence that you've got, we think you would be better seeking civil court action, then that would be for that survivor again to make that choice. If a survivor says to the lawyer, well, actually, I know that I could probably get more from civil court action, but for me it's about more than finance, then that needs to be respected as well. So it's very, very unique to the individuals, but my understanding from the consultation process is that the majority of survivors who have been waiting 20 years or whatever, they just want this done and dusted. They want to be able to move on with their lives and put abuse behind them, because the longer this goes on, the longer they're having to engage with those thoughts and those memories, etc. So I think it probably would make a difference to the survivors. That's just based on what's been said.
Can I bring in Mr. Collins, and then I'll follow with Mr. Whelan and then Ms. Rennie. Thanks. So Mr. Collins first.
Thank you. Well, Helen's already mentioned the fact that a higher level of payment would assist. There's 2 points I wanted to make. One of them is about the differences between the level of payments proposed and the level of payments proposed that were made in Ireland. And in looking at that and the responses to level one, in particular the government's response, there's reference made regularly to the fact that there's an intention to set up a non-adversarial system here. But what I can't understand legally is why that is linked to the level of payment. The benefit of a non-adversarial system is the ease of access for those who apply and the reduced legal costs. And as a lawyer, suggesting that legal costs should be reduced could get me drummed out of my private clubs, but there we are. But as a matter of fact, reducing legal costs is the advantage that the scheme brings. But that shouldn't affect the level of payment, because the abuse that has been suffered is what triggers a level of payment. The fact that you've made it easier to access that shouldn't justify a lower level of payment. The second point I wanted to make, Helen has raised the pre-64 survivors. When this consideration of redress was first raised along the lines that we're talking about today, it's been discussed for many, many years, but one of the significant moments was Angela Constance announcing that there was going to be the bill to remove time bar. And at that point, and I know David was there in the room at the time as well, as was Helen and others, the promise that was made was that those pre-64 survivors who cannot have their time bar removed will be treated in an equitable way comparable to post-64 survivors. The only way that can be achieved is by the pre-64 survivors being able to achieve through this scheme what they would have through the courts. So there needs to, and it's unfortunately, for obvious reasons, a reducing number of pre-64 survivors. But if we are to deliver on the promise that was made back then and has continued to be made since, pre-64 survivors must be assessed as for a payment that they would have achieved, because they don't have the option of going to court. So there shouldn't be an upper cap on that. And I can make a final point very briefly. In terms of the banding of payments, there are huge gaps just now, 20,000 to 40,000 to 80,000. And the Scottish Government response is that they, paragraph 30, they remain concerned that a wider range of payments may result in different payments being offered for similar experiences. Wherever you have a line drawn and people on one side of that line receive a payment and people on the other side receive another, there will be those that fall either side of that line, and their experiences may be similar. When you have such a wide banding, the difference is double the payment, so 20,000 to 40 to 80. That is all the more stark than if the difference is less. So there needs to be a greater number of bands and more assessment introduced. So those are the comments I would make on payments just now, unless there's anything I can help.
Thank you. I'm going to, Mr. Aitken has managed to onboard for the meeting, so just welcome him to the meeting. Can I bring in Mr. Whelan to be followed by Ms. Rennie? Thanks.
Hi, first of all, I'd like to thank our clinical professionals who we commissioned to write up the assessment paper on behalf of FPGA. It was clear from the draft government assessment paper that there were so many elements missing, And out of the consultation came very, very clearly that the survivors wanted the unique individual experience recognised in any process, and that they wanted a thorough assessment of that testimony, so that testimony would recognise the whole experience of the survivor, not just the abuse experience, but the life circumstance experiences. So currently, what's not addressed in the process is aggravated circumstances. There's racial, sexual, disabilities elements not recognised in the assessment. There was racial discrimination in a number of children suffering abuse in quarriers because of their colour. There's a significant handicap of survivors accessing the labour market because of what's occurred to them. Loss of opportunity is not addressed in the assessment. So really, it goes really to the heart of what actually is the payment system. The payment system should be there to address the whole life experience of the survivor. And the payment system currently goes from 40 to 80. Now, from the financial memorandum, it's clear it's clear that the Scottish Government have based their calculations on everybody will be pushed down into a calculation sum. The majority of them will be around 32,000. But how they arrived at that calculation, first of all, I don't know without seeing the people. And secondly, the payment levels can certainly be expanded, can be improved. You just have to look at other schemes. So the gaps. If you have the things in that says what we are saying is missing, what our clinical professionals are saying is missing in the assessments, if you address those, then you address those gaps. So the payment level should actually go all the way up in numbers. It should go beyond 80,000. It should go beyond 100,000 and into 125,000 for the most extreme exceptional circumstances. And if you look at the Lambeth case, and I would ask the committee to have a good look at the Lambeth case in terms of how they've approached this, the modelling that they've done, how they've actually approached this in terms of identifying what you could call the scaling levels and matching that with people's experiences. I would propose that the Lambeth model is an excellent model. If you look at the outcomes in the Lambeth model, first of all, 83% of applicants to the Lambeth model received payments. Council legal fees were 7%. Applicants' legal fees were 10%. And we clearly want a process which is survivor-centred, survivor trauma-informed, and puts the survivor, as you have said, Claire, yourself, in one of your statements, at that process. So it is difficult for us to see how this was arrived at. And we are working with the model that came out of the consultation. But from my recollection, there was no other models on the table. And so we've had a look at Janine's model, and there's merits in some of Janine's models. And we would say the reason, this is a model on the table, this is the model we are working with, and there was no other choice from my recollection of other models. So what we've tried to do is to improve the bill as best we can and help with the government. And can I just also just say, I want to say thanks to the Scottish Government, and in particular I want to say thank you to Mr John Sweeney and his officials, Claire Soper and Donald Henderson. we recognise that there's been significant progress made in the latter years, and that has happened actually under Mr Sweeney's brief, and so we thank him for that, and we want to thank him for the engagement of the Scottish officials. The conversations are difficult, but they can be overcome, and we are committed to working with the government to overcome those difficulties.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Whelan. I'm going to bring in Ms. Rainey. Ms. Rainey, we're missing the start of that. I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. Just on your point, in terms of if there was a higher level of payment, would survivors accept the waiver? The survivors have been very clear that no, they wouldn't accept the waiver. They still feel that they should have the choice, and they know that there are plenty of opportunities where, if there's double counting of money, then as with the criminal injuries cases, there could be other ways of sort of reclaiming any money that's been paid out, so there's not double counting. So they're very, very clear on that, and it's not about the level of money. Survivors have been very clear it's nothing to do with the level of money, it's the betrayal they feel. So they're very clear that they still would never agree to the waiver. They feel very, very, very strongly about that and wanted me to stress that. But I totally welcome David's paper. I think that's the first time we've ever really talked about the impact on survivors, and reading through it, I was resonating with everything that was said there about the long-term impact on survivors of abuse, and I don't feel the levels are adequate at all. I've worked we've been delivering the in-care survivor service now since 2008, so that's 12 years. And I've worked personally with survivors on a therapeutic basis, and the level of physical, emotional, all forms of distress that we've seen in everybody we work with is really significant. And essentially £80,000 is 2 years' salary for a lot of people. So whereas we've worked with people who have never been able to work just through the severe distress that they've faced, how do you compensate for that? So I feel really, really strongly about that. But also the clients don't want a system of a panel. They're very unhappy about the idea of a panel, and they don't want to have to speak about their experiences to anybody else. They've done it so many times. So one thing that people were saying to me yesterday is, so since we started 12 years ago, we've worked with thousands of survivors in a clinical way. And we have a huge number of clinical files, which are incredibly thick. And survivors have said to us that they're quite happy to access their files and then present their files as evidence, which show the significant levels of physical and emotional distress that survivors have faced. And survivors feel that in a lot of ways that's their evidence. Some of them have worked with us for the whole 12 years. One of the survivors that worked with us for the full 12 years actually gave me a letter to bring to the committee, but because he felt really strongly, he said, there's nobody who represents me. He said, I speak for myself. He said, I know there's other survivor organisations around the table, but there's nobody who represents me. I feel I was betrayed all through my life, and this particular survivor hasn't worked for the last 20 years due to the level of abuse that they faced, and lives in poverty all the time, and said, I might feel compelled to take that money, but I'll want to kill myself a year later because I felt compelled to take that money. Now, that's what we really need to consider here. We're dealing with, as David's paper shows, human beings who have been through distress that nobody should ever have had to experience in their lives. They were betrayed and let down. And we're arguing over, I find it really uncomfortable even to argue about this waiver. It shouldn't be there. It should be a case of survivors have the absolute choice that was taken away from them as children. They didn't have that choice. They were placed into a care setting against their will. And, essentially their lives were destroyed. So we can't take away this final choice from them. This is what we've all been fighting for years. And the survivor I was referring to has been fighting for his entire life. And we shouldn't be taking away the choice for those survivors as to how they receive their redress, whether they go to a civil court or whether they go to the redress scheme. No amount of legal advice is going to make them able to understand what that's going to mean to them when they make that decision. And that's what's really important to me, because I know survivors who feel they've settled and then feel really horrible about that. and we really need to think about what's the impact on suicidal ideation down the line, and I don't think that's been considered.
Thank you, Ms Rennie. If I could just pause a moment and say to everyone, I see that both Mr Whelan and Ms Holland have indicated they want to come back in on that point. But I also have, and just for the record, I've gone back to Ms Mackay. I've got Ms Wishart, Mr Johnson, Mr Greer and Mr Green all wishing to ask questions as well. So survivors, don't mind, I won't come back to you this time, but if you do want to address previous points in answering the questions going forward, it's just I want everyone to have the opportunity to both say their piece but also to ask their questions, if that's okay with everyone. So I'll go back to Ms Mackay just now, please. I think Ms Mackay's finished with her question, so if I could move to Ms Wishart, please.
I'd just like to ask the panel's views on the composition of the redress panel. I'd just like to get their understanding of where they are on that at the moment.
So I'm looking to new indications. Mr Whelan, please, yes, go first.
A wide range of skills. It should at a very basic should be trauma informed across, but there would be a wide range of skills, and I think no, when I say I think, sorry, we suggested what the skill set may be in our first submission. So the important thing for the panel for us is that the panel is independent, is impartial, has lawful discretion to make independent, impartial decisions. And we believe that lawful discretion should be on the face of the bill in relation to the panel. And I just want to come back to a couple of points that were previously said. In terms of the waiver, we have had advice, legal advice, from international lawyers that the waiver will, in the Scottish circumstances, be unlawful, even if the government tries to add that there was different circumstances in the Irish case. We had it confirmed last night by international lawyers who actually worked on the Irish case. So if you bring a waiver in, our understanding is and I'm saddened that we've actually got to this point. I'm saddened that, as Janine says, we are arguing over a waiver which has so many strands to it, supposed to make the scheme successful. It's just incredible. I'm astonished by the deafening silence from the Catholic Church and from the Catholic establishment. We've not heard anything. It's not my role. I don't represent those organisations that were in those institutions, the children that were in those institutions. But clearly, I think Parliament has a duty to, for the voluntary contributions. Warriors have committed, Crossreach have committed, Aberlour have committed to try and find a way, if the conditions are right, to make contributions. We want the scheme. We believe if the waiver is not there, that it will enable people to make those voluntary contributions. But it can't be, people are looking at Quarriers, Aberlour and Crossreach, and actually they've already committed to doing this. I think we should be looking the other way and looking at all the organisations who haven't committed to doing this. And the other thing I just want to say is that in terms of eligibility, we're really struggling with, and the government needs to really understand this, is that you've had all these institutions investigated by the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, yet half of those institutions, the former residents in those institutions, it's not legitimate for them to come to the redress scheme. How can you really base a system that you've had an inquiry on and then deny those former residents access to a redress scheme. Now, what we are saying to the government is you have a once in a chance lifetime, if you want to call it that, to redress all the issues. Ireland has had to do, they're now going to do their third redress scheme, which will start in April. But the Irish have set it up in about 3 months, or will be setting it up in 3 months. So what we're saying to the government, not the Irish route is addressing all the issues for all the survivors from every single institution. And what we are trying to say is that this is what the government needs to consider, not 1, 2 schemes, 3 schemes, because the government will have to revisit this. And that's what we are trying to say to them, is address this. You've got an opportunity really now to really address this and make this scheme one of the best in the world. We're last to do anything. Let's not pretend in Scotland. We are last to do anything.
Can I bring in Miss Holland, please?
But
I'm not sure if Helen dropped off.
No,
I think we might be having a
sorry,
wee bit
can
of
you hear
trouble.
me now?
We can hear you, Helen. We can't see you. And I know you've indicated. Yeah, we can see you now. Thanks. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. Sorry about that. No, sorry, I got logged out there. I still remember the question. So my response to the question would be the issue of a panel was within the consultation papers. But to be honest with you, other than that, there haven't been a great deal of discussions yet around the panel, who would be on the panel, all that type of thing. That has still to be covered. And obviously, you know, we would be asking that the panel members be qualified, trauma informed, qualified, financial qualifications, etc. Whatever the situation is. But those are conversations that haven't taken place yet. In relation to who is engaging with who, the reality is when it comes to the redress, you know, we're not privy to the conversations that are taking place between government and care provider bodies, and I think part of that's maybe right in a way, because the onus of the burden of responsibility as to who's paying what shouldn't lie on the shoulders of the survivors. The survivors are already carrying so many burdens. This would just be yet another burden. So, you know, as I say, like those conversations haven't taken place yet, so it's difficult to answer the question that's been asked.
Okay, I haven't seen indications from Miss Rainey or the other panel members to come in on that point. So I'm going to go back to Miss Wishart. I think Miss Wishart's indicating that a question's been answered. So could I move to questions, please, from Mr. Johnson? Not hearing Mr. Johnson.
Right, I'll unmute myself.
Oh, no, you're fine. You're fine now.
You got me now? Good. Look, I've got 2 questions. They're related, and I'll just wrap them into one. And they're both about evidential requirements. So obviously in our written submission, there was a lot of detail on that, certainly a subject that we examined quite a lot. And indeed, it follows on from what Janine Rennie was just saying. So I'd just be interested from the panellists what they would like to see in terms of the requirements that applicants will need to make in terms of evidencing their experience. Do they agree with what Janine Rennie was saying? Or what? How should that requirement be formulated so that it's clear and also easy for survivors to present that evidence? That's the first question. What should the evidential requirements be? The second one, I've received a direct communication from a survivor who is also very keen that any information or evidence that is obtained by Redress Scotland be provided back to survivors. Their point being that many survivors simply don't know everything that happened to them, don't necessarily know where they were or why, and that certainly it's possible that Redress Scotland could obtain information that they simply don't have. So again, I'd be interested from panellists, because it's not something we took evidence on, whether some sort of requirement for Redress Scotland to hand back any information that they have, obviously subject to privacy requirements and protecting other individuals' privacy. So those are the two questions: evidential requirements and a requirement to hand any information back to survivors at the end of the process.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Collins and then to Mr. Whelan.
Thank you. Well, firstly, at INCAS, we've had a lot of experience of engaging with the child abuse inquiry. And it's clear from what Janine has been saying that there are organisations where survivors have engaged, such as her organisation, and spent a lot of time explaining and, to the extent, having to relive the traumas they've suffered. So whatever the basis of the gathering of evidence, I would suggest that it has to be borne in mind at all stages that where possible, if evidence can be gathered from any source without the requirement of survivors having to then go over again grounds that's so painful and that they've gone through before, that would be the only approach I think that would be appropriate. I welcome the fact that an approach is going to be made to the inquiry, because many, but not all survivors who will want to come forward have engaged in inquiry. That's obviously a fact, but those that have, that's one means of gathering their evidence. I welcome the fact that an approach should be made to Lady Smith to see whether or not the information that is already held there can be used. And on the point about returning information, I'm aware that in the course of survivors giving evidence to the inquiry, they have encountered documents that relate to them which they hadn't seen before, records which have been lost after many years of struggles trying to find out this information and put together, in some cases, a sense of identity from that. And I can't speak on behalf of survivors, but I've observed the fact that the distress that it can cause sometimes, that those documents are then locked back into a vault, essentially, because they're contained within a confidential arrangement. So it seems to me, from my position of observing the reaction of survivors, that it would be appropriate when information is obtained that is then left with the survivor to use as they wish.
Thank you. I'll go to Mr. Whelan and then Ms. Rainey.
And Simon is saying you don't wish the survivor to keep repeating their experience. They've repeated it many times to people. I think what's important for us is that it's the survivor at the heart of the process. It's the survivor decides and chooses in terms of the support mechanism that they would wish to have to take them through that process. In terms of evidential requirements, people ask me, David, when did this all happen? And for FPGA, it all started in 2002. But can I tell you, and I want to pay special tribute to two women who had the courage and the tenacity to highlight the Quarriers abuse issues in the media in 1984. One was Jan McQueenie and one was Doris Black, who went to the media and were ostracised by the state, were ostracised by the government, because they had the tenacity to raise issues in the media about the abuse they suffered in quarries in the 40s, 50s and 60s. So their evidence, and unfortunately those people are deceased today, but their families will have some evidence. So that's where next of kin comes into. But secondly, in terms of evidential requirements, we talked about the standard of proof in our submission, and the standard of proof needs to be lawful. And we keep hearing from government, this is not a civil proceeding process. And my concern about the evidential standard of proof, if I have a concern, we want it to be robust, we want it to be credible, but our concern is that many survivors pre-1964. Many records were destroyed. Many of those evidential, what you would think are normal evidential requirements are available. Unfortunately, they're not available to the survivors. So we are concerned that if you put the bar too high, that what you're doing is you're actually going to exclude so many survivors. So you need, I would say to the committee, you need to really consider that in terms of where the threshold. We have an open mind on where the threshold is. We've just addressed it in terms of what I've just said. In terms of data and governance of the actual Redress Scotland, first of all, I want to put on the record, we believe that Redress Scotland should be independently regulated, have independent audits, have independent and impartial surveys in terms of its functions. It's not going to give survivors confidence if the whole process is embedded in government and it's all, you know, the reports come out from government that it's fine. Unfortunately, they are not independent and impartial reports. So that's important to put on the record. In terms of the gathering of evidence, one of the things we're concerned, and Mr. Johnson, Daniel Johnson has just touched on it, is that what happens to that evidence when you give that to that process? Where does that evidence go? Where does the consent and permission of the survivor start, and where does it end? Now, if the survivor is putting in a document and it requires to be validated, then for us, you should go back to the survivor and ask that. You shouldn't just unilaterally send that document out to a third party without the permission, express consent of the survivor. In terms of sharing information, I agree completely with Mr. Johnson, what he's saying. If the Redress Scotland has information that the survivor has not previously had access to, then within the Data Protection Act and abiding by those that legislation, there needs to be ways to be found to be sharing. Redress Scotland just can't think that they can hold everything, and people who haven't had access to things and they have information on them, we believe they should share as much as that data and as much as that information is possible with the individual.
Okay. We'll move to Ms. Rennie and then Ms. Holland, please.
I would say it's really important that this is a survivors process to go for redress. So the information that they provide to whatever body is set up, I think should be their choice. We've been very involved with the Advanced Payment Scheme in terms of the access to records. In fact, since InCare Survivor Service was established in 2008, one of our main roles has been to access records for survivors. So we already hold substantial records that survivors have looked for over the years, and a lot of the client files will contain their access to records information with evidential information on what care home they were in and so on. One of the concerns, as I've said before, when I was giving evidence, is the number of fires and floods and the fact that a lot of evidence no longer exists, unfortunately. So for some care homes, like two of the care homes we're dealing with at the moment, the reports back have been there are absolutely no records. And we've tried our hardest to go through old school records and all sorts of different routes to try and find evidence that people were in that care home. But that's been really, really challenging. And then from there to sort of provide evidence that abuse took place. So this is coming across all the time from survivors. But one of the really important things about when clients access their records is that they're their records and that they should have support to go through those records. We initially developed the model of access to records through the Care Leavers Association down south. They gave us some support to set that up from experience they'd had. And what very clearly came across from them was that there would be things in those files that people didn't know about, siblings they'd no idea about, all sorts of information that was a surprise to them. So therefore, for their safety and for addressing risk, it's really, really important that they're supported through that process of accessing their records. And we've been really encouraged by the advance payment team who have seen this really responsibly and who have worked with us to ensure that we can access client records but also provide support, and we would hope that that would continue. As I say, in Care Survivor Service they've got 12 years experience of doing so, but I would say these records should belong to the survivor. I've been clear about that from the beginning, that every bit of information that is on a survivor should belong to the survivor, and that does fit with GDPR legislation. I don't think if the panel managed to find any additional information, it should be going to the survivor first so that they choose what information is then shared, as you would if you were looking for records of your GP records, whether to give to an insurance company. So it should be your choice as to what information is then shared, because there might be aspects of your past that you don't remember being discussed, and you should have a chance to go and reflect on that. And I would just ask the panel to reflect again, as I've said before, how would you feel if some stranger got hold of your GP records and there was things in there that you didn't want anybody to know? It should be the survivor's choice. What is known redress is their scheme, and it should be absolutely their choice what is shared within that.
Thank you. I'll go to Ms Holland and then back to Mr Johnson.
Thank you. I would just like to say that at the moment there's an assumption that evidence is going to have to be a high level of evidence, but there's been nothing said in the debate or anywhere else to suggest that. I mean, I think the whole point of the redress scheme is that the evidence required would be less. I take on board exactly what's being said. I mean, with regards to records, I mean, for years survivors were told that records didn't exist, etc. But the Child Abuse Inquiry has proven that to be absolutely wrong. I mean, I was told there was no Procurator Fiscal records, for example, and they appeared before I was due to give evidence. So the reality is, I think there are records out there that are not being made available, and obviously within the redress board, if there's something in place that means that there's a evidence that needs to be, the people that hold the records are compelled to provide them, and the survivor with a support worker is able to go through the records, not necessarily for the sake of proving that they were abused or whatever, but to find whatever it is the survivor is wanting to put before the panel. Absolutely, Incas's position is that any evidence that is already out there that avoids a survivor having to go through over and over again their experience has to be a priority. But with the advance payments team, I know many of our members who have applied to the advance payment team who thought they didn't have anything, who were told they didn't have anything, and the support people within the advance payment team, or the people who were dealing with the applications, they were able to find that evidence. So I think there's a lot of evidence out there that people think is missing, but it's still there. I'm not saying that'll be the case for everybody by any means. There will be some survivors who have difficulty, absolutely, and I wouldn't sit here and say otherwise. But I think on the basis of evidence, which is the question that was asked, we actually don't know what level of evidence is being asked for at this stage. So until there's clarity on that, we're making the assumption that the evidence requirement is going to be high. And my understanding from the feedback from both from the minister and the officials is that the evidence required is going to be much lower, and the way that the redress is set up, the way that it's written, it talks about it being more trauma informed, so therefore they don't want to put survivors through reliving all their experiences. That's my understanding to date of the way that it's being set up, unless I've picked it up wrong, but I don't think so.
I think Mr Phelan had indicated he wanted to come back, and I'll go briefly back to him and then to Mr Johnson.
Very briefly, Convener, I agree completely with what Janine is saying, and I also agree with a number of points that Helen has raised. And secondly, in terms of the evidential requirement being lower, Mr Sweeney is on record, and it's in our submission that he said the evidential requirement will be lower. So I think that really is what the I suppose the committee has to come to an agreement, and Parliament has to come to agreement. Where do you set the standard of proof that matches the lower evidential requirement? Thank you.
Mr Johnson?
To those two topics.
Okay, thanks, Mr Johnson. I'll move to questions from Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to turn to the issue of fair and meaningful contributions from the organisations. It's somewhat following up something that Helen said in response to, I think it was the first question from Ian Gray. There's obviously a tension here around what fair and meaningful contribution actually is. But if we were to work from the assumption that these contributions will be met directly from the organisations, probably from their reserves, because this isn't a scheme the insurers will engage with. If we start off with that premise, the challenge then becomes how to ensure an appropriate level contribution from the organisation, but also that no matter what, any survivor who comes forward is able to get financial redress. And that takes us to the point that Helen made around how much of it comes from the government, how much of it is public money. Some organisations will be able to cover all of what's asked for them. Whether they do or don't is up to them. Obviously, it's voluntary. But for others, given that we cannot predict how many people come forward and how much the sums are, it may be that some of them it is simply just not financially possible. It's not realistic for the organisations to cover it themselves. It may be that some organisations wish to give a lump sum at the start of this process, and we find that by the end of it, the demand from survivors from their organisation outstrips what was in that. I'm not asking for those on our panel today to come up with a solution for that, and I recognise that what survivors overwhelmingly want is redress from the organisation, not from the government. But it would be helpful to just have some reflections from the panel on what it would mean for survivors if we end up in a situation where organisations have made what is broadly regarded as a fair, meaningful contribution, but it simply doesn't cover demand, and there are some survivors who come forward whose financial redress comes overwhelmingly from the government.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in Mr Phelan, then Ms Rainey.
Respectfully, Mr Greer, I would disagree with what you're saying about the institutions, about survivors expecting them to have the burden, the complete burden of this. The ultimate responsibility lies with the state, so that there should be a shared burden on this. And the providers, as we can see, have asked for a fair, meaningful, affordable sustainability conditions to be set, so that that would enable them to contribute. And for us, we believe that would enable lots of other institutions to contribute as well, who wish to contribute, and they may wish to contribute. Some of these institutions no longer exist, so this is again where there's an issue with the waiver. But some of these institutions have trust funds that are ongoing and operate slightly different, but they may wish to contribute. So I think we need the committee and need to take a sort of open view of this, that every organisation will be different, and the expectation that an organisation based on numbers should be paying more than an organisation that is very rich today and maybe doesn't exist but has assets in all over the place that could be accessed. I really think the scheme has to make it that it's attractive for people, to, institutions to contribute. And there will be. I just think it's inevitable that some institutions are not in existence. Other institutions can't afford it. You know, I think it's on record that the survivors do not wish to damage the institutions. You know, and so I think. Can I just say this in terms. The waiver is the issue about the contributions, and I apologise for going back to this. I'll tell you what we've told quarriers, because I've been asked by survivors, what happens if the waiver comes in? What are you going to say to quarriers, David? Well, we have told quarriers. We recognise that you're trying to reconcile, that you've made huge steps, just like the Scottish Government has made significant steps to address the issues in the last few years. We recognise that you wish to contribute. Generations of children have been failed by the organisation, and the organisation recognises that through the Child Abuse Inquiry. So we're saying, don't fail the current children, don't fail the current users. If the waiver comes in, we are going to say to quarriers, we respectfully acknowledge it, but we're asking you to keep it. We're asking you to put that contribution into the aftercare service, enhance the aftercare service, and we're asking you to put that contribution back into current services. Because if you put us in a position where we have to sign something which is unlawful, which will not hold the government to account, or will not hold the abuser to account, as Helen said, we will not hold the institution account, then I'm saying to you, we don't wish to sign that. So keep your contribution and put it into non-redress, and enhance the aftercare service.
Okay, can I bring in Miss Rennie and then Miss Holland, please?
And that's a really interesting and useful point that David made about aftercare. I think what's really clear is we've worked with, and we have evidence of 367 care establishments, and as well as 367 care establishments, we have probably as many foster carers who have used children in the past. So Bernardo's and quarriers and the large institutions are a bit of a kind of distraction from that, because although there's been in the Catholic Church, because although there's a number of survivors that were abused in those settings, a lot of the settings haven't even been investigated by the Child Abuse Inquiry, and there are a huge number of those who are out there who are, a lot of them, as David said, are no longer with us. They've shut down years ago. A lot of the foster carers are no longer alive, and essentially there's no way they could contribute to a scheme. So that was another thing that the survivors were saying to me loud and clear. They felt it was a focus on a particular number of institutions where they felt that excluded them entirely. And again, I think that's the wrong approach, because it makes survivors feel that some organisations are out in the limelight in terms of being the ones that have abused children, and obviously they've been very focused in the Child Abuse Inquiry. But there's a whole load of survivors who feel lost in amongst all of this, and they're the ones that were abused by maybe a really small institution, but there might be 2 or 3 or 4 of them that were in that institution, and they feel as if they've just, and that institution's no longer there, so there's nobody to be held accountable. And a large number of survivors say it is the absolute responsibility of the state. A number of the homes that they were within were state-run institutions, so they might be through local authorities. So they feel really strongly that, you know, the paying into the scheme in a way doesn't affect them. It doesn't apply to them. So I think even if you were to get what you would perceive as a reasonable contribution from an organisation that's now running as a charity that's helping people, then essentially survivors will worry about that. As David said, they'll have concerns about that. And I think it's really important to see that this isn't the answer in any way, because you'll miss out all those people. How do you answer those people who are going to be excluded? Because their foster carer died 10 years ago and can't be involved in it and can't contribute. So you really need to think about what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with what's out in the public eye or what's the big stories. We're dealing with every single establishment. And like I say, Wellbeing Scotland and In Care Survivors have got evidence of 367 establishments and probably just as many foster carers. So that's what you need to consider.
Okay, can I go back to Miss Holland and then I'll come back to Mr. Greer?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that you went looking for us to come up with the answers as to the question that was asked. However, I would say, I absolutely agree with Janine. There are many, many people who were in foster care. We equally have survivors who were in foster care. The reality is, within the foster care system, that would be under the care of the local authority, and therefore the government would be responsible to cover those costs. And yes, there are particular places who, because of the length of the time, they no longer exist. And on that basis, the cost, unfortunately, would probably lie with the government as well. But where there are care provider organisations, and there are still quite a few, where there are care provider organisations who could contribute to the scheme, our opinion is that they should contribute to the scheme. 90% of the survivors said that they wanted contributions to be from the state, who were primarily responsible, and also from the organisations who, in many cases, were aware of the abuse but did nothing about it. So on that basis, and I know this isn't an easy one for the panel, and Ross Greer made that clear when he asked the question. It's not for the survivors to come up with solutions to every question. Survivors already have enough burden on their shoulders without coming up with all of the solutions for redress. Yes, we can give input, and I'm absolutely grateful for being able to do that, as I'm sure David and Janine are as well. But the reality is, it's not for us to come up with the solutions. Redress has taken place all over the world, and they've probably had the same difficulties. I never ever expected Scotland to be different. I always knew this was going to be the most difficult part of everything that we've done over the years. And it's absolutely proven to be the case.
Can I go back to Mr. Greer, please?
Thanks, Convener. The answers to the questions are more than adequate. I don't feel I need to come back in, but I think Mr. Whelan might be indicating that he wished to come back on this point.
Yeah, and I'm going to go to Mr. Mundell, because Mr. Mundell, I think, it's a supplementary around this area. I'm not sure if it was in yours or the previous question. So I'll go to Mr. Mundell and then to Mr. Whelan, and he can wrap up those responses if possible. Mr. Mundell, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. It was on the previous question. I was probably a bit slow in typing in the chat box, but to just follow up on the point that Daniel Johnson was making, and it was in terms of the kind of burden of proof and evidential requirements. And again, I'm not looking for the panelists to kind of come up with the solutions, but I just was interested in their thoughts on whether survivors and victims themselves would expect a different level of evidence to be provided for the higher reward payments, or would they be expecting the kind of same burden of proof and sort of evidence to be required across all the payment levels if we continue with that approach?
Okay, I'll go to Mr. Phelan first, please.
In terms of what Helen said previously, I just want to say I fully support what Helen is saying in terms of what she was saying previously. I just want to put that on the record about the last question. In terms of, and actually Helen's just actually answered the question. Well, for us, she's answered it for this question, because it's really not down to us what the evidential levels will be required. We are being asked to come up with all the solutions, and while we can help explore the various solutions, ultimately, for us, it will be the panel that will make that decision. and should have the power to make that decision independently and impartially. If you're saying there should be certain thresholds for certain payments, then we would say yes. But I say that with caution in terms of, again, what evidence is available for survivors. A 1964 survivor, they may be struggling to find the evidence that meets the higher threshold, but actually the government has already acknowledged that they are disadvantaged by not being able to access civil litigation. So I think, as Helen has said, we will explore and continue to explore with the government solutions and help them find solutions to a number of the questions. But for me, for FBGA, just like the inquiry, there comes a point where the chair makes a decision in the inquiry make the decisions, and for us, there'll come a point where the panel will be making the decisions, and they'll be independent and partial, and that's why I reiterated it again. The panel's discretion should be on the face of the bill. Their independence should be on the face of the bill. Their impartiality should be on the face of the bill. That power needs to be given to that panel.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Mr. Collins and then Ms. Rennie, please.
Thank you. The question, or part of the question that I noted was, if there is a standard of proof set, does it follow that where there are higher payments being sought or appropriate, a higher standard should be applied? And I think the simple answer has to be no. The standard of establishing abuse has to be the same. The level of payment is to reflect the level of that abuse. It's not a case where if somebody has suffered the most horrific level of abuse as a child and throughout the rest of their life thereafter, that they should then have to be held to a higher standard to establish that than someone who was still abused and horribly abused but at a lesser level. I don't think the standard should change. One thing I wanted to make the committee aware of, though, which may or may not be aware of, is that the experiences of the inquiry have been that various organisations have been called upon to observe the evidence of survivors. They have the opportunity to put questions to survivors when they've been given evidence. Not one single survivor who is given evidence of the abuse that they have suffered at the hands of these providers has had their evidence challenged in any way significantly by the providers. And at the end of every passage of the evidence, the providers have been given their opportunity to make submissions and have accepted or have stated that whilst they maybe do not know what happened, they are not saying that the survivor's position as advanced is untrue. So that is the position that's been adopted for a number of organisations so far. And that would suggest to me that there is not, whatever else there may be about avoiding liability, there's not an appetite amongst the providers when they are faced publicly with the situation for suggesting that those who've been brave enough to come forward and share their experiences as a child should be disbelieved. That's something that the panel can take forward, that if you have an organisation, for example, who's spoken to inquiry and that has accepted that abuse has happened and that they're not disputing that, that's a relevant factor for consideration when weighing up the redress claims.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Ms. Rennie and then very briefly Mr. Phelan before I come back to Mr. Mandel.
Thank you. That was one of the tensions that most of the survivors we'd spoken to. We did a survey with survivors to ask them as well, and about 90% of them said they didn't want a scale, and the reason they didn't want a scale is because they didn't want survivors having different levels from each other, because they felt that would make one survivor feel that their experience was worse than somebody else's, and they might have just been unable to provide the same level of evidence. And being unable, what I say when I say that is, and I've mentioned this before, for some survivors, they've never told anyone in their family that they were sexually abused, and they're not going to tell anybody. So they will never tell anybody that they were sexually abused. I spoke to one of survivors I counsel yesterday, and he said that. He said he will never tell anybody that he was sexually abused, even if being sexually abused meant he would get a higher level on the scale. So it's really, really difficult. And again, we're not looking at the complexity of these issues where what somebody feels comfortable to disclose or not. So many survivors, although they felt as if the original consultation way back when a scale was presented, a lot of them hadn't been part of that consultation, and then they felt the scale was the only thing presented to them in the subsequent consultation, where they're saying if they were asked that question, they would have said no, a reasonable level of redress for everybody, and for everybody to be equal, because you can't scale the impact. One person might have had one experience of abuse that's affected their entire life, and somebody else might have had abuse and have managed to function in life and managed to go on and live life in a really fulfilling way. So it's very difficult to make that assessment. And even with all due respect, even if the panel is made up of a whole load of professionals, without them really knowing that survivor, and they won't know that survivor in the space of the time that they're accessing the panel, they're not going to be able to make an assessment like that, and it's going to leave the survivor community. And I have to say, throughout the years of me working in this field, and I'm a bit sort of standing back from it because I'm a chief executive of an organisation, I've seen survivors pitched against survivors, and it's been really damaging to everybody throughout this process. And I'm really, really concerned about a process that might continue that.
Thank you. I'll go to Mr. Whelan and then to Ms. Holland before going back to Mr. Mandelis. Mr. Whelan, again.
Some of what Janine's saying has merits, and again, if we had more time, we could have looked at what that model was. That would have been helpful to actually scrutinise the model that Janine is talking about. In terms of evidential thresholds and requirements, in our submission, we've said, and we're talking about the process here. The process has to be robust and credible. It has to prevent fraud, and it has to support genuine applications. And I think there has to be a recognition here. This is public money, and it has to be managed appropriately and properly. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring in Ms. Holland, please?
Sorry, just very quickly in response to what Janine was saying, our members have made it perfectly clear, as did the people who engaged with the consultation process, that they didn't agree with the flat rate payment. I can't think of anything that would be more unfair. I mean, how can you justify, for talking sake, someone going into care as a toddler? And we have one member who actually didn't leave the care system, wasn't signed off from the care system till the age of 24, and suffered horrific abuse during that period of time. There are, and I mean, I'm not saying that abuse wouldn't take place within, let's say, a few months or a year or whatever. I mean, but the reality is, people's experience of the care system is so unique to them. It's very much to the individual, i.e. the length of time they were in care, the level of abuse, etc. So to make it a flat rate payment across the board would, in the opinion of the people of INCAS, would be unfair, and they wouldn't see that as justifiable. And I think that, if anything, would probably cause even more division among survivors. This is about justice. It's about survivors being able to walk away from redress feeling that they've achieved justice and go on with their lives, and start the repairing the damage that's been done to them.
I'm going to go back to Mr. Mandel. Did you have a final question? Are you content?
I'm happy with that, and I think it's helpful. I just want to clarify that it's not that I don't have a sort of strong view one way or another. I just wanted to highlight the fact that it is a complicated issue.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Mr. Whelan for a final comment because you put an R in it. But can I say to everyone, if you do feel that there's something that you wanted to say and weren't able to today, by all means get in touch with our clerks, and we'll ensure that that's shared with the committee before we start stage 2 deliberations. And bring Mr. Whelan in finally.
Thanks, Chair. I agree with Helen, and you can see from the clinical assessment paper that we have put into the committee, this is about an individual. It's an individualised, unique experience, and that's what we're talking about here. which is survivor-centred, survivor-informed. So it's about the individual, it's about their lifelong experiences in relation to what may have happened to them in care. Thank you.
Thank you. And a huge thank you again to survivor organisations that have been with us today and for your willingness to engage with the committee during this process. It's been extremely helpful. I'm going to suspend for 2 minutes just to allow the Minister to get on board to the session and allow our current panel to leave. But again, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks. Thank you and welcome back to committee members. Agenda item 8 is coronavirus and impact of further and higher education. And can I welcome to the meeting Richard Lockhead, MSP, Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science, Roddy MacDonald, Head of Higher Education and Science Division, and Alan Scott, Senior Policy Manager, SAAS, at the both at the Scottish Government. And can I invite the Minister to make an opening questions and ask members to indicate they wish to ask questions by putting an R in the chat. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Convener. I hope you can hear me okay?
Yes.
You can do, thank you very much. Can I just thank the committee for the opportunity to give evidence this morning. Much has happened since we last met. We have supported many students to return home for the winter break, and we set out how best to enable their safe return for term 2 as well. And our European Union exit transition also came to an end. More recently, the new COVID variant, of course, has thrown up serious new challenges, and our colleges and universities and community learning sector, as well as all our students and staff, have a significant role to play in our national efforts. The enormous work undertaken in recent months by the staff in our institutions and accommodation providers and our students to help limit the spread of the virus and ensure everyone's safety not be underestimated in such challenging circumstances, and for that I thank everyone involved. We recently published guidance on the 15th of this month, and also frequently asked questions on the 22nd of January to provide clarity required by our colleges and our university staff and students and their families on the arrangements for the start of term 2. For most students, the message was and remains stay at home. Across the country, we're asking people to limit their movement and interaction, so those students who returned home for the winter break should not return to term time accommodation unless advised to do so by their university or college. The only exceptions to this are for those small number of students where attendance is absolutely critical and where education can't be delivered remotely or postponed. And it's worth remembering that all arrangements are subject to a future review of COVID-19 conditions in Scotland. With learning being predominantly online throughout January and February, I understand this is not the education experience that students expect or deserve. We must always remember too that this has been a very difficult time for college and university staff, both professionally and in terms of looking after their own well-being, and I've been very, very impressed by the way in which our staff have gone above and beyond supporting their students' education in the most trying of circumstances. On student well-being, colleges, universities and accommodation providers have a duty of care to students, and we expect institutions to ensure that students are fully aware of the new measures in place and have the support they need to study remotely. We have further supported student mental health and welfare by providing additional resources, and we continue to support NUS Scotland's Think Positive initiative, which now has a COVID-19 focus as well. For students living away from home, I have asked accommodation providers to treat students sympathetically and take their circumstances into account so they are not disadvantaged. I welcome the many, many examples of universities and other providers offering significant discounts, rebates or refunds to students, and I strongly encourage other providers to consider how they can treat students sympathetically as well. I understand that many students are also taking advantage of the provision that's in law to withdraw from leases for accommodation, and have written to providers and students reminding them of this provision. There's also been a very positive development, which of course was confirmed yesterday. We were delighted as a government to announce £30 million of additional funding to support both institutions and others for lost revenue due to accommodation costs, and to provide further support for affected students who find themselves in hardship due to this crisis. This will allow both colleges and university students who require extra support to be able to access it, and also help relieve pressures on institutions who have faced additional costs arising from rent refunds and rebates and issues around that. I'm also pleased to tell you today that I'm creating a short-life task force which will assess the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on student hardship, and I want that group to determine if the mechanisms and measures currently in place are sufficient to mitigate against student hardship in further higher education at this time. The group will convene for the first time in the next few days. Also, being aware of the potential long-term impact of education attainment and the financial impact this pandemic is having on our colleges and universities, I've also agreed to the setting up of a task force to consider these issues, looking to term 3 and indeed beyond. And before I close, today's new higher education statistics for 2019-20 that were published show that a record number of students were enrolled at Scottish institutions, and the number of Scottish domiciled was at a 10-year high. Members may also be aware that for this academic year, UCAS recently also reported that Scottish domiciled acceptances are at a record high at institutions in Scotland as well. And really importantly for higher education, it also brings the good news that the widening access interim targets in higher education of 16% of full-time first-time degree entrants to Scottish universities should be from our 20% most deprived areas. It has now not only been achieved but exceeded. And I want to thank everyone involved in the sector who have helped ensure this important milestone has been reached. In summing up, I've said this obviously before to the committee many times, but it remains absolutely true. The challenges for all concerned within further and higher education are unprecedented, and so has the response. It is to the enormous credit of all the agencies, our college and university staff, our students and all the unions, that their response to these most difficult circumstances has been so helpful and so positive and made a huge difference. So I greatly appreciate that, and I look forward to continuing to work with them and indeed the committee throughout the remainder of the academic year.
Thank you very much, Minister. Can I say that we already have 7 indications of questions, so if people could be succinct with both questions and answers, it would help us ensure that everybody gets their opportunity this morning. Can I move firstly to questions from Oliver Mundell?
I don't know if
I can hear you now, Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask, firstly, it's from anecdotal feedback about whether the Minister had any information on the number of people applying for university next year. I've had some suggestions, both from young people and from one institution, that application numbers for university next year are down, most likely as a result of a kind of fear of a repeat of the situation we've seen this year, where some young people have spent more time at home than at university, and obviously the quite concerning scenes we saw in terms of COVID testing. Is that something that the Minister's picked up on?
Minister?
Hi, I thank you for that question. It's also highlighting a really important issue in terms of the impact of the pandemic on plans of particular young people in Scotland for next year. The UCAS deadline for higher education was extended, of course, and it's not until the end of this month. We've still got a few days to wait yet for that, so we don't have any official statistics for a few days yet in terms of the first window. And I have no doubt, though, that there will be many young people who are perhaps, reflecting on where we are at the moment and be taking a bit more time before they take a final decision as to their plans. So we're in a very challenging period at the moment because we're in the middle of a national lockdown, so I can understand why young people may be thinking that. But I think it's important that we do encourage our young people to take decisions as quickly as possible, to submit their application to UCAS in the remaining time available and in future windows, and look to the future. We will get through this. It's very challenging just now, and I know in the middle of a lockdown perhaps it doesn't seem quite as obvious as that, but we will get through this, and it's really important that our young people take advantage of further and higher education opportunities in Scotland. But we've not had any specific feedback on that yet, but we are, as you can imagine, paying close attention to it, and we'll await those initial statistics from UCAS in the next few days.
Mr. Mundell?
Thank you, Convener. In the event that some institutions, and I think there will be some institutions who are more affected than others, and some courses, particularly some practical courses that people feel have been so limited that there's been really no point in being on the course this year. For courses like that and for institutions like that, will you look at additional financial support or the support that's available, so that they're not affected in the longer term for what's likely to be a one-year issue?
Yes, we will look at all these issues, and as I just said in my opening remarks, that's one of the reasons why I've set up this Short Life Task Force to look at the impact of Term 3 and some of the challenges we're facing in our colleges and universities. Colleges, of course, face perhaps even bigger challenges because of the short-term nature of college courses, and therefore there's not built-in time to catch up, so to speak, like there would be with a university degree or over 2, 3 or 4 years. So that's the purpose, if I can assure Mr. Mundell, of that task force, is to look at that, work out how we can help as many young people to complete their learner journey as possible in this academic year, but of course look at what the options may have to be to help people if there are other plans that have to be put in place. And of course the Scottish Government will have to work with our institutions over any financial consequences of that.
You're mindful of the importance of protecting the long-term future of some smaller, further and higher education institutions.
Yes, absolutely, and we're working very, very closely with the Scottish Funding Council. So because of the impact of the pandemic, as well as wider challenges, which have been there for some time, then we're getting regular updates. And of course, I can again assure the committee, that our colleges and universities will get through this. We have shown enormous flexibility, particularly the Scottish Funding Council, in the way in which it's delivering the funding to our colleges to help them get over their challenges.
Thank you. I'm going to move to questions from Mr. Johnson and then to Mr. Greer. Mr. Johnson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Last summer, provision, as I understand it, was made for the potential extension of dental courses, and that was something that, at the time, dental schools in Scotland advised to students was a possibility. I have been informed by a constituent of mine that that's now actively being considered. Certainly, that is the information that one dental student has reported to me. I was just wondering if the Minister could confirm, both in the specific instance of dental courses, whether there is
going to be a requirement to extend completion dates because of the nature of the practical course, and indeed for other practical courses such as medicine, whether there's going to have to be an extension of course lengths in order for people to complete practical elements which are not possible to complete right now.
Minister?
Clearly, the lack of face-to-face teaching has an impact on some courses more than others. Daniel Johnson's quite right to highlight dentistry as the one that's mentioned most frequently to me as a course that's affected. And I know the universities with the dental courses are looking at contingency plans to help dental students graduate. However, I do know also it's challenging because quite clearly there are just some practical aspects of that course you have to have before you can qualify, and that's proving challenging at the moment. So because my health colleagues in the Scottish Government are the ones closest to this, because the Health Secretary and her colleagues deal much more closely with the universities over the medical degrees and dentistry degrees, I'd be happy to send some follow-up information to the committee, but I do know this is something that Glasgow University and other universities are actively considering at the moment.
Mr Johnson?
I'd be grateful if the Minister could, in particular if that could be specific or regarding which institutions are considering it and what the likely length of deferment might be. On a much more specific and more widespread point, obviously the inability to conduct face-to-face teaching is widespread throughout the sector. I'm just wondering if the Minister had a specific number on the percentage of both undergraduate and postgraduates who have actually returned since the Christmas break, and indeed what does he expect that number to be or reach in the coming weeks? Obviously that's not going to be a static picture.
Yes, it's a difficult question to answer precisely, but we laid out our guidance for the return for this term, and that anticipated no more than 5% of students being on campus across Scotland, and we have no reason to believe that's been, breached to any great degree. So we're keeping a very close eye on that. We do know from all our feedback from our universities and especially our colleges that there's very few numbers of students on campus at the moment. In terms of students who stayed over for Christmas and didn't return home, I think the figures are around 6,000 or 7,000 students stayed in purpose-built accommodation. There will of course be many others who stayed in private rented accommodation, and I've got dozens of anecdotes from meeting families and students themselves who are still living at their student accommodation because they never went home for Christmas in the first place. It's difficult to give a precise number, but that 5% figure is where we estimate it should be around.
Mr Johnson?
Thank you, Convener. I'll leave my questions there, but I'd just add my request. If the Minister could also provide in writing details of any other courses beyond medical and dentistry, which I gather, I understand why health colleagues would be better placed to us, but if he has information about other courses, whether they're in the sciences or other courses which have practical elements, I think that would be very useful to have if there's going to be any similar deferments for those sorts of courses.
Yeah. Can I bring in? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Minister. Can I bring in Mr Greer to be followed by Mr Green? Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, when you came to the committee last May, I think it was, certainly before the end of the 2019-20 academic year, you expressed a little bit of concern about the variability in how further and higher education institutions were using their student hardship fund, that there was maybe an indication that students at some universities and colleges were finding it easier to access than others. Given that we're now quite far on from that, both in terms of phases of the hardship fund, monies made available, and the situation through the pandemic, do you now have a clear idea, a clear breakdown by institution of the number of requests that were made, how many of them were granted, and how much they paid out? You obviously know how much each institution got to administer the fund, but do you have a clear idea now of how they've administered it? And if you do any concerns remain about variability?
Minister?
I have seen figures in recent days, and the money is going out the door, and there's clearly a need for hardship funds. As is said, it's a variable picture across all institutions. Our colleges have put a lot of their money out the door, and some universities have, and some universities perhaps have still got some balance left in their funds. And of course, after yesterday's announcement, we're topping that up by a further £20 million. Of the £30 million announcement, £10 million goes to institutions to help them offset some of the losses from accommodation refunds and cancellations, etc. And the £20 million is going to, via the SFC, to institutions for hardship funds. I've spoken to many of the teams around the country who are working in our institutions and who are allocating the hardship funds and dealing with the applications. These applications have been made a lot more flexible over the last few months, and the limits and the amount of money that can be given out has been lifted as well. So I don't detect any major issues at the moment, but it is something we are keeping under review. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we've set up this task force, which will meet for the first time in a few days, and we're going to bring together the various advisors that are working within the universities, as well as student representative bodies, as well as the agencies, to look at what the issues are that have arisen out of the hardship funds. One of my issues, for instance, is the coordination with other funds in society which are available to students, and sometimes it can be quite a complicated picture for students as to where to go. And also awareness raising is an issue to make sure that all students are aware that those funds do exist and that they can access them if they qualify. So there are some issues in there. And if the committee wants me to write back on that, I can give more detail.
Mr. Greer?
Thank you, Minister. And it would be very useful if there is further information you could provide in writing, that perhaps some version of the data that you mentioned you've seen in the last couple of days. My second question is specifically around college students and access to remote learning. I've had a number of lecturers and students themselves raise concerns with me about unequal access to remote learning for all the same reasons that we're very familiar with in relation to schools. When we as a committee and Parliament as a whole discussed this in relation to schools, it's been mentioned that COSLA were the ones who tried to do some kind of assessment of the level of need, tried to work out how many laptops would be required, how many families would require assistance with setting up a home broadband connection, for example. What equivalent assessment has been done to figure out what the needs of college students actually are in relation to remote learning? Do we know how many college students needed a laptop a few months ago, how many still need one now?
Thanks. The colleges in particular have put a huge amount of effort into making sure that laptops have been distributed to students. And we, of course, launched a £5 million digital inclusion fund, which helped 13,500 post-school learners. 13,000 of those learners were college and university students. So we've got a record of how many have been helped through our funds. The universities and colleges have topped up these funds with their own funds and sourced their own laptops. So again, the Scottish Funding Council are doing some work on this, and it's a significant issue. And of course, the colleges have raised with us, as part of the budget discussions, that digital access is an ongoing issue. So again, there's other sources of funding that families who've got students in the household can access. I'm only talking about the funding which we've issued through further and higher education sources.
Mr. Greer?
Thanks. I appreciate that information about the funding being made available, Minister, but my question was more specific. It was about the assessment of need. I think you said something, the Funding Council were involved with that. Has a clear assessment been done? Was a number at any point produced equivalent to the number that COSLA produced for the number of school pupils who needed a laptop?
I've not seen a figure like that from the SFC yet, but that's because it's been a moving feast. There's been so much ongoing work. Laptops are being made available through colleges and universities, as I said before, through their own funds as well as the Scottish Government funds. And I know Colleges Scotland have also been looking at this, so they may have more up-to-date figures than I've got at the moment.
Mr. Greer, is that you finished?
I'll leave it there, Convener. Yeah, we could follow that up in writing. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mr. Gray, please?
Thanks very much, Convener. The last time, Minister, you committee heard evidence from you about the impact of COVID on universities and colleges, you said, that was in November, you said you were being advised by the Scottish Funding Council. Well, today we see the Scottish Funding Council have advised that the university losses due to COVID amount to around £132 million. So do you not feel that the £10 million announcement that you made yesterday is pretty woefully inadequate, less than 10% of what the Funding Council are telling you our universities need?
Minister?
Horrible pandemic that's taking its toll.
Sorry, Richard, we missed the start of that. Could you start again? Sorry, I think you started to speak before the mic switched. Thanks.
I was just saying that the financial impact of the pandemic across all society is enormous, and that is also the case for our colleges and universities, that there's been a substantial impact of the pandemic. The Scottish Government has been very keen to help where we can. We have provided over £160 million of support to our colleges and universities, over £100 million to our universities, over £60 million to our colleges. That was prior to yesterday's announcement of £30 million. Of the £130 million figure that Ian Gray mentions in terms of the cost of the pandemic to universities, £32.5 million of that is estimated to relate to accommodation issues, refunds of rent and so on. So we've provided £10 million towards that. So yes, it's not the full £32 million, and we'll consider to review what more we can do to help. And of course, we've got the budget being presented in draft form to the Parliament tomorrow. So I absolutely accept this is a really challenging time. Overall, when I spoke to the committee previously, I think last time I spoke, the projected deficit for our universities as a result of the pandemic was about £176 million. The latest figures down to £50 million. And of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were talking potentially of deficits of hundreds of millions of pounds. So it has been a moving picture, and that's just because of the nature of the pandemic. But I just want to assure Ian Gray that we're paying very close attention to financial challenges facing our universities and indeed our colleges.
Mr. Gray?
Well, the universities have made very clear in the submission that they made to the committee that they need around £200 million of additional funding in the budget tomorrow in order to achieve sustainability. So I'm not going to ask the Minister if that's going to be in the budget, because I know his answer will be that we'll find out tomorrow. But there is one very simple component of the financial problems that universities face, which the Minister could fix. He talked earlier about statistics showing record numbers of Scottish domiciled students going to Scottish universities, and of course that's very, very welcome. But one of the problems the universities have is that those students, of course, don't pay tuition fees, but the Scottish Government also does not fully fund their tuition when they go to university. They pay only a part of those tuition fees. So they stop universities charging tuition fees, something I support, but they also don't in fact provide the funding for those Scottish domiciled students to study. So every additional student which goes is actually a financial burden on the universities at a time when they're under financial pressure for all sorts of reasons. So a very simple and fair way of supporting universities would be for the Scottish Government to begin to fully fund their free tuition policy. Will the Minister do that?
Again, I fully accept that we have a range of challenges facing further higher education at the moment, but I think the outcomes we're getting from our colleges and universities in Scotland are outstanding at the moment, and I gave some statistics earlier on about the fantastic job our universities are doing in producing graduates, and likewise our colleges are achieving exceeding their targets for full-time equivalent students as well. Clearly, we do have the review underway from the Scottish Funding Council, and the issues that Ian Gray mentions is one of the reasons why I commissioned that review, to look at the sustainability of funding going forward. There's always been cross-subsidisation within our universities. Overall, the full economic cost recovery in Scotland is higher than the rest of the UK, but I accept within that there's a separate figure below that for the teaching element, and Ian Gray quite rightly highlights that's well below 100%. So that is part of the thinking going forward, is how we address that, and that's part of the SFC review. And in terms of the university's budget submission, of course, we're taking it into account. It's a huge ask. I don't have to tell you that a 20% increase in the university budget is a huge ask, and given the state of public finances in Scotland, obviously, that is a very tall order. But in terms of the overall pressures facing the sector, we're taking that on board going forward.
Mr. Gray?
Does the Minister really need a review to tell him that it would only be fair for the Scottish Government to actually fully fund their own free tuition policy?
In terms of free tuition in Scotland, we firstly invest well over £200 million every year in free higher education, which benefits our students in Scotland. And in terms of what we do pay for each place that we do fund with universities, we have the £1,820 per student for a fee, and over and above that, the teaching element in the Scottish Funding Council is brought in for each student as well, and that depends on the course that's being studied by each student, and there's different groups of payments. All these groups of payments were increased by 1.7% for this year. So there was a slight increase in the teaching element provided to our universities. But as I said before, we have maintained over £1 billion a year for higher education in Scotland against 10 years of austerity and against other financial challenges we're facing. And of course, we have tomorrow's budget coming as well.
Can we move on to questions from Ms Mackay, please? Thank you.
Convener, can I ask the Minister about the guidance around essential attendance of staff and students, and whether you think any additional guidance is needed? You said in your opening remarks that you expected institutions to just look after the students' well-being, and I'm just wondering, is expecting them to enough, or do you think that they have enough guidance around that?
The universities have assured us that they are going to a huge effort to support students who are staying on campus at the moment, as well as in the very few limited situations where face-to-face teaching is proceeding, to ensure that is extremely safe, and of course the guidance is there for that. There's no evidence that face-to-face teaching is not safe in terms of the pandemic. Of course, the overall approach to students returning to university and college is about transmission of the virus in Scotland. I think the guidance we have is satisfactory. I've not received significant feedback since we published it. We have regular discussions with the trade unions, as well as the institutions and student representative bodies. So I'm hoping, I understand it's an evolving situation all the time, I'm hoping the guidance is working well, and that the universities are abiding by it. And of course, we stay in close contact because people are not shy in coming forward if that's not the case.
Ms Mackay?
Very briefly, and so you think that nationally it's quite a sort of complete picture, or do you think that some institutions are better than others at actually dealing with this, or any having difficulty with it?
Well, clearly the universities are anxious, and the colleges as well, about the ability to complete courses and qualifications. And the guidance at the moment, of course, reflects the national lockdown we're in just now. So this is a very difficult issue. We will have to carefully consider future guidance, because quite clearly the lockdown will be reviewed, and the Scottish Government will be saying more about education, I understand, next week, to give more clarity to schools and indeed colleges and universities. So it's just a really difficult place we're in at the moment, because quite clearly the colleges and universities are anxious about the impact on learning, and of course we have to balance that with protecting people's health. So we're keeping it under constant review.
Ms Mackay?
That's me, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring in Ms Wishart, please?
Thank you, Convener. Minister, I'd like to ask about rent rebates. I've been stopped in the street by families locked into bills for university accommodation. They want to support their children as much as possible, but they don't know whether they should carry their contracts on in the hope that there'll be an opportunity to return to campus later this year, or whether they should give them, give up the contract. So I wonder what your advice is for students and families in that situation, and what's being considered in terms of helping students cope with private contracts this year.
So I very much welcome the decisions that have been taken so far by many universities to refund rent or to cancel rent or to allow people out of contracts even without a 28 days notice, which is helping tens of thousands of students across Scotland. Each university, of course, is autonomous, and we can't dictate to them how to run their own buildings and their own accommodation blocks. But I do think they're doing their best to help people, and of course we discussed earlier on the financial impact of them doing that. So they are clearly doing it if it's costing them. We have just in the last few days written again to other providers of student accommodation in Scotland, asking them to make sure they're being sympathetic and helpful and pointing out the guidance to them. In terms of private landlords, I absolutely accept this is a really difficult situation for families. Of course, there's such a myriad of circumstances out there, and many students are still in their private accommodation and others are not. And it's very, very difficult even for the universities and institutions to have a picture of who's in their flats at the moment and who's not. So my advice to families is please download the guidance about students not returning to campus, send it to their landlords in private accommodation. I know constituents who've done that, and therefore they secured a significant discount on their rent for a few months. So I can only urge students to speak to their institutions and take advice from them. They should be being very sympathetic just now, and for those in private rented flats, to make sure they're showing the guidance to their landlords and trying to get a discount or rebate. And of course, if there are financial difficulties, to go to the hardship funds.
Thank you. That is helpful. Can I ask? Daniel Johnson's touched on the issue I want to raise about students returning to their courses that involve practical elements. Unsurprisingly, some are not keen to return, but they're worried about being penalised for missing parts of their course. So have universities been asked to be sympathetic to students who want to delay in-person elements, and is there an assurance that there will be no detriment to students who want or need to stay home?
So the institutions have already said that they are going to do their utmost to make sure that no student is disadvantaged by the pandemic. Now, clearly, the challenge that they do face are those courses where, quite simply, you have to have the practical element or the face-to-face teaching element before you can qualify. We can't have students graduating from college to fit gas boilers unless they've actually dismantled and put back together a gas boiler. They can't do that online. And likewise, for some of the courses we've spoken about at university, it's a similar situation. So these are the real difficult issues that we face at the moment in colleges in particular. There's a lot more practical work required for qualifications, and also in universities for some of those courses where there's face-to-face requirements. That is why, as I said before, I've set up this task force. We're bringing the agencies around the table with the institutions and student representatives and trade unions to look at what needs to be done to help all our students in Scotland complete their learner journey. Now, everything will have to be on the table when we look at the options. We're in I hate using the word over and over, but unprecedented situation. Therefore, the solutions, no doubt, will have to be unprecedented as well to make sure we can help everyone complete their learner journey.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Can we move to questions from Mr. Neil, please?
Just two quick questions. Just following up on your previous point, Richard, about your working party. One of the issues, as you know, is the transition from school to university and or college. So will the working party be looking at those people who are transitioning this year from college to university or college? Because clearly there are very big challenges this year which wouldn't normally have been there, not least the fact that most of this year will have been spent either learning or remote learning. And my second quick question is more generally for existing students in both the college and university sector, what's being done to monitor the mental health and welfare of students, in particular, you know, both those who are in attendance for reasons that you've outlined, but also the ones who are doing remote learning, you know, because clearly it depends. It's like school pupils, you know, if they're remote learning in an overcrowded house or in a poor area, they don't have access to the equipment that maybe other students have and so on and so forth, it can start to drag people down, obviously. So are we monitoring the well-being of students, as well as looking at the additional challenges of transition this year?
Thank you for those questions. Firstly, in terms of the transition from school pupils to college or university, and from college to university, absolutely, that's one of the key purposes of the task force we're setting up. We do recognise there's significant challenges in there, not least for planning, you know, what the figure's going to be, how many people are going to be coming. So these are significant issues, and that will be at the heart of the task force work. And likewise, John Swinney, the Education Secretary, of course, is looking at the school situation and what the implications are for the senior phase. And in terms of mental health, I have to admit this has been one of my biggest challenges, is how do you monitor and measure the impact on mental health of students who are remote learning. And I don't think we've got a perfect way of doing that yet. I've asked the question several times myself. What we have done, of course, as I said before, is give more resources to institutions for mental health services, which they've warmly welcomed. There's a lot of great work going on at the coalface with the new counsellors that have been employed across college and universities over the last year or two, and they're still being put in place, as well as existing services, student welfare services. So they're doing their best to reach out to students and stay in contact with students. And I've heard a variety of anecdotes from students who feel they have been made aware of what help is out there for mental health. I've heard others as well, of course, saying they're not aware of what's out there to help. So we have to absolutely keep a close eye on this. And all I can do is assure Alec Neil that we raise this with every conversation we have with the sector, and indeed they raise it with us, is the impact on mental health of young people.
Mr. Neil?
In the interest of time, I'm happy to pass on, Convener.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of supplementaries left, and I believe that's the end of questions. If you haven't indicated, please do so again. But I've got firstly Mr. Green and then Mr. Greer. So I'll bring Mr. Green in first.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning still to the Minister. Can I just press a little bit further on the money that was announced for support for universities and students? I appreciate the details yet to follow, but I think what students are perhaps looking for is some reassurance that some of that money will directly support them with rent refunds. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on whether the money is going to the institution on students, or whether some of it will go directly to students? And also, as others have mentioned, not all students are in halls of residences owned by universities. Many students are in HMOs, private rented accommodation, or indeed private student accommodation, and will have been out and away from class for 3 or almost 4 months, perhaps even longer in some cases, yet are still under contract to those organisations. Will any of that money be able to go to them, and how will that work in practice?
Yes, the £20 million out of the £30 million that's going towards hardship funds will be available for students, and that is to also take into account the fact that we do know many students have not been able to work. They've lost their part-time jobs in hospitality and so on because of the pandemic, and their financial situation is compounded by the fact that they've got less income because of that, and they're paying rent for accommodation they may not be using, or they've not been able to get a refund for, or whatever. So we are asking the institutions to be as flexible as possible. You're quite right, we only made the announcement yesterday, and this is money coming out of this financial year, so there will be more detail worked up in the coming days to give some guidance to the college and universities about the funding. But I've spoken to many teams, as I mentioned before, and the committee may wish to do that as well, as take evidence from some of the teams working at the coalface on student hardship issues. It's fascinating speaking to them. They're extremely passionate about what they do. They're busting a gut to help students, and they're doing an amazing job, and I pay credit to them. So we're giving them that flexibility, but I would anticipate, because we're talking about a significant amount of money here, and that's on top of the other resources already in the system for hardship, and indeed the other £5 million we announced just before Christmas, that will be helping many families or students who have rent issues.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. That's very helpful, and absolutely, we all commend the great work being done on the ground in colleges and universities, especially the good work of NUS Scotland, who, as you know, their survey was quite worrying, where it showed that even at the moment, a quarter of students are simply unable to pay their rent, and around a third are unable to pay their bills. Which my concern really, and I hope others share it, is that we won't see dropouts of students who simply give up on their further and higher education. I wonder if any analysis has been done on the effect of COVID on participation rates, on dropout rates, and of course on those who are taking up further and higher education next year. If any analysis has been done on that, and if the Minister has any thoughts as to how we can support those on the ground who need money, now or yesterday, rather than in the weeks or months ahead.
Yes. Firstly, in terms of the new hardship funds, I would be expecting that money to be made available very quickly and get out the door very quickly, and that will be in our guidance. We don't put a lot of conditions around this. There is conditions in terms of, for due diligence, but we give flexibility to the institutions largely about how to use the funds and determine, because it's discretionary funds, it's discretionary, so it's in the hands of the institutions, the significant degree of who to give the money to and how to allocate it. In terms of withdrawals and students or young people who may be put off going to further higher education in the future, this is a very difficult issue to, again, measure. We've discussed this with the colleges, and colleges are very concerned about it, so they have been giving us some warning signs that they're worried about deferrals, and that students, certain cohorts of students, could just become disengaged college, because the longer they're learning at home, they just feel more and more disengaged, and they may drop out. So we're again, asking the colleges to keep us up to date with that information. We don't have a specific picture at the moment because lockdown, it's a few weeks old, and that information will become available in due course. So we have to do our best to support students while they're remote learning. And in terms of the government's overall policy of the pandemic, we have to balance the harms going forward. So as Higher Education, Further Education Minister, I'm also conveying to all my colleagues in government about the harms. So we have to protect people's health, but we also have to balance all the harms in further education, higher education, and young people becoming disengaged is one of the harms we have to try and avoid. So as Colleges of Scotland give us more information, we'll do our best to keep the committee up to date.
That would be hugely appreciated. I think that data is really vital in monitoring the situation on the ground. I guess just finally, could you give an indication, I guess we don't know what we don't know around the virus, but do you have any idea of when you think students will be able to return to face-to-face learning? I know March at the very earliest looks the most likely, and when they do return, what plans does the government have in place for a testing regime that will give both college university staff and students themselves some confidence that these institutions will be safe places to return to?
Well, the first question is obviously a huge question, probably above my pay grade, as to when university and college students can return to campus. At the moment, clearly, we're still in a challenging situation with the virus, and our initial guidance was that we may have the ability from mid-February onwards to have some more courses going back where face-to-face is absolutely critical, but we're talking about a very small number of students. And of course, every other student, the the general message is we're staying at home until the end of February, and the beginning of March is the earliest by which we anticipate beginning a further stagger of students going back to college and university. So I'm not really in a position to say any more than that at the moment. Clearly next week we'll be in a better position to see whether that mid-February review date is still possible, as to allowing maybe some more courses to go back where face-to-face is essential. So we'll update people next week on that. And I'm trying to remember your other question, sorry.
Testing,
sorry. And testing, the testing regime is now up and running for students returning. It's very quiet, so it's a skeleton staff that's been employed by the universities at this stage, and it will be, of course, up until no doubt the end of February at the earliest. So it's there, and we've extended the testing regime to students who are returning and also those who've stayed on campus at the moment. So there's several thousand students who've stayed on campus or at their term time accommodation, and they're entitled to the test as well. So we've extended who can get the test, and it's in place already as we speak.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mr. Greer now? Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Just to quickly follow up on the line of questioning from Beatrice Wisher. Minister, if a student was to request the termination of their tenancy agreement under the terms of the Second Coronavirus Act, do you confirm that there's absolutely no need for their accommodation provider to ask them for medical advice or a note from their GP?
That's absolutely the case, and of course in our frequently asked questions, which we've just updated in the last few days, we've made that clear in that, and I would advise everyone to visit the Student Information Scotland website. All students and their families should use Student Information Scotland and the website, and they'll find about the guidance as well as the frequently asked questions. So it's unacceptable for any accommodation provider to ask for doctor's notes or any other evidence of the pandemic being the reason as to why students want to withdraw from their leases. They should be being sympathetic and just accepting the word of the students that the pandemic's the reason why they're making the request.
Thank you. I've got one final question. Minister, you'll be aware that a number of colleges, particularly Forth Valley College, are converting a number of their lecturer positions into instructor positions or some other variation on that title, essentially asking the same people to do the same job but for less pay and weaker terms and conditions. Have you engaged with colleges on that specific issue at all, and are you concerned about the effect that that will have on a lecturing workforce who are already under immense pressure for obvious reasons at the moment?
Yes, I have spoken to the sector, or I've spoken to the Scottish Funding Council about it and asked them to give me a report on this to see if the impact that many people fear on the professionalisation of lectures in our colleges is being negatively affected by some colleges employing more instructors. So the SFC will get back to me to give me their opinion as to whether it is having that impact. We want to support lecturers being professional positions in our colleges and further education. It's always been the case, of course, that colleges have employed instructors who quite often are people from workplace environments who have the skills to pass on and are not necessarily lecturers. However, it's important in light of the concerns expressed myself by the trade unions who have also met to discuss this, that we have that assurance from the Scottish Funding Council that it's not having any negative impact on the profession of lecturers in further education.
Mr. Greer?
That's very useful to you. Only final question I've got is the SFC report that you mentioned. When are you due to receive that?
So the SFC report, I'm very encouraged by. I think it's going to be quite radical. We've seen, of course, the first phase where they published many of the themes that the consultation had brought out, and I think there's some exciting themes that have been identified by our institutions and other observers and commentators and people who've submitted their views about the future of further higher education and tertiary education in Scotland. Phase 2 is due next month, so hopefully that will be still happening. But I know that the Scottish Funding Council have been absolutely snowed under because of the pandemic, so that may slip slightly, and I'm sure they'll keep the committee up to date.
Okay, Minister, can I say thank you very much for your attendance, as always, at the committee this morning, and to your officials as well. The committee will now suspend until 11:30 and reconvene on Microsoft Teams. And thank you to everyone for their attendance today.
Thank you.